I'm Clara, 38 female. I live a quiet life in a small town, working as an archivist for the local historical society, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. My world has always been one of order, of cataloging memories and preserving truth. That orderly world was shattered when my parents passed away, leaving behind not just grief, but a legacy that my siblings were determined to steal for themselves. They thought I was just the quiet, overlooked sister they could easily push aside. But they had no idea I was about to unearth a family secret that would change everything. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The old house felt hollow. It was a cavernous, echoing space that had once been filled with the booming laughter of my father and the gentle, humming presence of my mother. Now, it was just filled with dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light and the oppressive weight of grief. My parents, Robert and Alina Vance, had been the sun and moon of my small universe. They were taken together in a car accident on a slick, rain-swept road just 3 weeks ago. The shock hadn't worn off. It felt less like a new reality and more like a prolonged, waking nightmare from which I couldn't stir. I was the middle child, the quiet one. My older brother, Grant, was 45, a high-flying investment banker in the city with a polished smile that never quite reached his eyes and a wife who measured love in carats. My younger sister, Serafina, was 36. She had rebranded herself from the Sarah we grew up with to Serafina, a name she felt better suited her online persona as a lifestyle brand owner, selling overpriced scented candles and hollow affirmations to her thousands of followers. I, Clara, at 38, was the odd one out, the archivist, the keeper of old things. I had stayed in our hometown, content with my books, my history, and my modest, peaceful existence. My parents had always called me their anchor, the one who kept the family history grounded in reality, while the others soared off into their own ambitious orbits. I never realized they also saw me as the family's protector. The three of us were gathered in the family home for the grim task of sorting through a lifetime of memories. Or, at least, that's what I was doing. Grant was on his phone every 5 minutes, barking orders at some unfortunate junior analyst, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings of the living room. He'd pace back and forth, gesturing with a hand that sported a watch worth more than my car. He hadn't looked at a single family photo. He'd only appraised the antique furniture, making quiet notes on his tablet. "This sideboard could fetch a pretty penny," he'd muttered at one point, tapping the polished mahogany my mother had painstakingly cared for every Sunday. Serafina was, if possible, even less helpful. She drifted through the rooms like a ghost in designer mourning where, taking artistic, black-and-white photos of dust-covered trinkets for her social media feed. Her captions were poetic nonsense about loss and memory, hashtags blooming under each post like digital weeds. Grief journey family roots saying goodbye. It was a performance. She was curating our family's tragedy for public consumption, turning our shared pain into content. She'd hold up one of Mom's old porcelain dolls, a tear glistening artfully on her cheek for a selfie, before carelessly tossing it into a box marked "Donate." I was in the study, my father's sanctuary. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and his signature pipe tobacco, a scent so familiar it felt like a punch to the gut. This was where he'd taught me to love history, to see the stories hidden in objects, in letters, in the faded ink of a forgotten diary. I ran my hand over his heavy oak desk, my fingers tracing the coffee cup rings and small scratches that were as much a part of our family story as any photograph. While my siblings saw the house and its contents as a collection of assets to be liquidated, I saw the soul of our family. The will reading was scheduled for the following week with Mr. Albright, our family's longtime lawyer. It was a date that loomed over us, casting a dark shadow on an already bleak time. My parents were comfortable, but not extravagantly wealthy. My father had run a successful construction business that he'd built from the ground up, and my mother was a prudent investor. The house was paid off, and there was a respectable portfolio of stocks and savings. It was enough to be a significant inheritance, to provide a cushion for the future. For me, it was a final gift from my parents, a symbol of their love and care. For Grant and Serafina, I was beginning to realize it was a prize, a jackpot, and they were already positioning themselves to claim the lion's share. The air was thick. Not just with sorrow, but with a crackling, unspoken greed. The storm was gathering, and I was standing right in the center of it, completely unaware of the tempest that was about to break. The whispers started on the third day. I had retreated to the attic, a place my siblings avoided due to the dust and lack of cell service, to begin the monumental task of sorting through decades of stored history. Up there, under the eaves, the world felt a little quieter. I could almost hear my parents' voices in the creak of the floorboards. I was sitting on an old trunk, carefully leafing through a photo album, when I heard their voices drift up through the floor grates from the hallway below. They must have thought I was out, or perhaps they'd simply forgotten I existed, as they so often did. The real question is the house. Grant's voice was low and conspiratorial, stripped of the booming confidence he used on his business calls. This was his true voice, sharp, avaricious. It's prime real estate, but we can't sell it with her in it. She's attached to this place like a barnacle. He didn't even use my name. I was an obstacle, a problem to be managed. I froze, my hand hovering over a picture of the three of us as children, smiling gap-toothed on a beach. Serafina's reply was a saccharine hiss. Honestly, Grant, what does she even need the money for? Her life is so small. A little apartment, a dusty job. She doesn't have our expenses. She doesn't have a brand to maintain or a portfolio to grow. Exactly, Grant agreed. Mom and Dad were always soft on her. Our little anchor, Dad used to say, it's ridiculous. They enabled her to stay small. We're the ones who took their ambition and made something of ourselves. We're the ones who deserve the bulk of the estate. It's what they would have wanted, logically. My blood ran cold. Logically, my parents had loved us all. Their love wasn't transactional. They were proud of Grant's success and amused by Serafina's online fame, but they valued my quiet life just as much. They valued my happiness. To hear my siblings twist that love into a justification for their greed was nauseating. I leaned closer to the grate, my heart pounding against my ribs. "So what's the plan?" Serafina asked, her voice dropping further. "Mr. Albright is an old stick in the mud. He'll just read the will as it's written. I bet it's a simple three-way split. It's so unimaginative." "Albright is old school, but he's just the executor," Grant said, a smug confidence returning to his tone. "The plan is simple. We present a united front. We talk about Clara's fragility, how she's not equipped to handle a large sum of money, how it would be better for us to manage her share for her. We can set up a tiny trust fund, something that spits out a pittance every month, enough for her cat food and library fines." They both chuckled. It was a dry, ugly sound that seemed to suck all the warmth from the house. "We'll say it's to protect her," Serafina added, catching on quickly. "To honor Mom and Dad's desire to see her taken care of. We frame it as an act of love. My followers will love that narrative. The devoted siblings looking after their helpless little sister. It's perfect." Helpless, the word echoed in the dusty attic air. They saw me as a child, a simpleton to be managed and patronized, whose inheritance was just another asset for them to acquire. The grief that had been a heavy blanket suddenly felt like a cage. All my life, I had ceded the spotlight to them. I let Grant be the smart one, Serafina be the pretty one. I was happy to be the quiet one, the keeper of stories. I never saw it as a weakness. But they did. They had mistaken my quiet nature for a lack of strength, my contentment for a lack of ambition. And now they were planning to use it to disinherit me. I sat there in the silence long after their footsteps faded away. The photos in my lap seemed to mock me. That little girl with the missing front tooth had no idea she was smiling next to vultures. The betrayal was a physical pain, a sharp, cold blade twisting in my chest. The sorrow for my parents was now mingled with a white-hot anger. They weren't just disrespecting me, they were desecrating the memory of our parents, turning their final act of love into a sordid cash grab. They wanted to write me out of the will. They thought they could manage me, control my future, and steal what was rightfully mine. I stood up, dust motes swirling around me in the dim light. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was helpless. They were about to find out how wrong they were. My siblings had started a war, and my quiet, orderly world was about to become their battlefield. They had forgotten that I wasn't just the keeper of our family's stories. I was also the keeper of its secrets. And I had a sudden, desperate feeling that my fight for justice was hidden somewhere in this attic, waiting to be found. My anger was a new foe. Unfuel, the grief was still there, a deep, aching void, but now it had a sharp, protective edge. I was no longer just sorting through memories, I was on a mission. My siblings saw this house as a treasure chest to be plundered. I now saw it as an archive, and I was going to search it for a weapon. I started with my father's old roll-top desk, which had been moved to the attic years ago. He was a man of meticulous habits, a builder who believed in solid foundations, both in his buildings and in his life. If there was a secret, it would be documented. It would be secure. I spent hours going through old receipts, blueprints for long-finished buildings, and decades of tax returns. It was a slow, painstaking process, the kind of detailed work my archivist's soul thrived on. Grant and Serafina left me to it, occasionally shouting up the stairs to ask if I'd found any stock certificates or jewelry. I'd reply with a noncommittal, still looking, and they'd leave me alone. They were searching for monetary value. I was searching for the truth. Late in the afternoon, when the light slanting through the single attic window turned a deep gold, my fingers brushed against a false bottom in an old wooden file box. It was a box labeled Personal Correspondence 1970-1980. It was almost imperceptible, just a thin sheet of wood that didn't sit quite right. My heart gave a little skip. Using the tip of a letter opener, I carefully pried it up. Underneath was a small, tightly sealed manila envelope. It was yellowed with age, and on the front, in my father's neat, architectural script, were 2 words. For Clara. Not for my children, just for me. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was what I was looking for. My hands trembled as I carefully broke the brittle wax seal. Inside was not 1, but 2 documents. The first was a letter, written on my father's personal stationery. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were clear. My dearest Clara, it began. If you are reading this, then your mother and I are gone, and my greatest fear is that your brother and sister's natures have finally gotten the better of them. I love all my children, but I am not blind to their faults. Grant's ambition has a cruel streak, and Serafina's vanity leaves little room for anyone but herself. I have always worried they would one day see your gentle spirit as something to be taken advantage of. I am writing this to give you a defense. A truth that only your mother, I, and our lawyer, Mr. Albright, know. I had to pause, my vision blurring with tears. He had seen it. He had known, all this time, the potential for this exact betrayal. He and my mom hadn't been naive, they had been prepared. I took a deep breath and continued reading. Before Grant and Serafina were even a thought, your mother and I had another child. A son. His name was Daniel. We were young, Clara, barely 20. We were foolish and in love, but we were also desperately poor. I was an apprentice carpenter and your mother was a waitress. We couldn't even afford a proper apartment. When we found out she was pregnant, we were terrified. We made the most difficult decision of our lives. We gave him up for adoption. It was a closed adoption, meant to give him a better life than we could provide. It broke our hearts, a piece of us that we never truly got back. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. A brother? Another brother? I had a whole other sibling I never knew existed. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The letter continued, we never stopped thinking about him. As soon as I had established my business and we were financially stable, we tried to find him. But the adoption was sealed, the agency long since defunct. We hired private investigators, but it was like he had vanished. We respected the privacy of his new family and eventually had to stop the search. But we never, ever forgot him. We set aside a portion of our earnings for him every single year in a separate, hidden account. It was our penance and our hope. My mind was reeling, a secret son, a hidden life. This changed the entire landscape of my family. The second document in the envelope was a formal, notarized statement. It was a codicil to their will, a legal addendum. It stated that upon their death, if their firstborn son, Daniel, or his descendants could be located within 1 year, he was to be considered a primary heir, entitled to a full and equal 1/4 share of the entire estate. Furthermore, it contained a clause that I had to read 3 times to fully comprehend. It stipulated that if any of their other children were found to have acted maliciously, or in a predatory manner towards another sibling regarding the execution of the will, their own share of the inheritance would be reduced to a token sum of $1,000. The remainder of their share would then be divided equally among the other, non-malicious siblings. My father's words concluded the let. This codicil is our final safeguard, Clara. Mr. Albright holds the official copy, but I wanted you to have this knowledge yourself. It is a shield for you and a long overdue gift for the son we lost. The bank account information is with Albright. It is your choice what to do with this information. You can keep it to yourself, or you can use it to find your brother. I trust you, my anchor, to do what is right, to honor the truth. Your mother and I love you more than words can say. Be strong. Your loving father. I sat back, the letter and the codicil resting in my lap. The air in the attic was thick with the weight of this 50-year-old secret. My siblings were downstairs, plotting how to cut me out of a 3-way split, completely oblivious to the fact that the pie was about to be cut into 4 pieces, and their own greed could leave them with nothing but crumbs. My father had given me more than a defense. He had given me a mission: find Daniel, find my lost brother. He had trusted me to be the keeper of this final, most important story. A wave of calm washed over me, displacing the anger. I now had a purpose beyond simply defending myself. I had to find him, for my parents, for myself, and for the brother I never knew I had. My siblings thought this was about money. They were about to learn it was about justice. The search for Daniel began not with a bang, but with a quiet click of a mouse. My profession, once a source of mild amusement for my siblings, was now my greatest asset. I was an archivist. My entire life was dedicated to navigating the labyrinth of the past, to finding needles of fact in haystacks of forgotten paper. I knew how to sift through digital databases, public records, and archives that most people didn't even know existed. I was looking for a ghost, a boy named Daniel, born roughly 48 years ago in our county and given up in a closed adoption. My first stop was Mr. Albright's office. I needed to confirm the codicil he held was real and to get the details of the hidden bank account. I called him and asked for an urgent, private meeting, stressing its importance. He agreed immediately, his voice warm and professional. I met him the next morning. His office was like a time capsule, filled with leather-bound books and the faint, pleasant smell of lemon polish. He was a kind-faced man with wise eyes, a stark contrast to Grant's predatory shark-like demeanor. "Clara," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your parents were wonderful people." "Thank you, Mr. Albright," I began, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I'm here because I found something, a letter from my father." I explained what I had discovered in the attic, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. As I spoke, a look of profound relief washed over Mr. Albright's face. "I have been waiting for this call," he said softly. "Your father gave me the original codicil years ago. He told me, 'Albright, if things go south after I'm gone, Clara will be the one to find the truth.' He had immense faith in you." He opened a safe behind a large painting of a ship at sea and retrieved a document that matched the one I held. "It's all here. The account he set up for Daniel now holds a substantial sum. He and your mother contributed to it for over 40 years. And yes, the bad faith clause, as I call it, is very real and legally ironclad." He confirmed the few details my parents had, the approximate date of birth and the name of the now-defunct adoption agency. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Armed with this official confirmation, I dove headfirst into the investigation. My days became a blur of activity, a secret life I lived while still going through the motions of sorting the family home with my siblings. By day, I'd be packing boxes of my mother's china, listening to Grant complain about the capital gains tax we'd have to pay and Serafina bemoaning the lack of good vintage pieces for her apartment. But by night, my little apartment was transformed into an investigative headquarters. I started with the adoption agency. Though it had closed in the 90s, its records had to go somewhere. A few deep dives into state archival databases led me to a county repository. The records were sealed, of course. A dead end for most, but not for an archivist. I knew the law. While adoption records are sealed to protect privacy, there are legal petitions that can be filed to unseal them under specific circumstances, such as an inheritance claim. With Mr. Albright's help, we filed an expedited petition with the court, citing the Codicil. While the court system ground slowly along, I worked other angles. I cross-referenced birth announcements from local papers in the year Daniel was born with public birth records, looking for male children with no named father or with details that seemed vague. It was a grueling, eye-straining process. I built a massive spreadsheet, a web of interconnected data points. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. My father's letter mentioned he was an apprentice carpenter at the time. I searched the business archives of the local paper and found the name of the construction company he worked for, Hollies and Sons Construction. It was a long shot, but I started looking for anyone else who worked there around the same time, hoping someone might remember a young, worried couple. I found a name in an old company newsletter, a foreman named George Bellamy. A quick search showed a George Bellamy, age 88, still living just 2 towns over. I called him, my heart in my throat. I introduced myself as Robert Vance's daughter. Bobby Vance? The old man's voice crackled over the phone. Of course, I remember him, hardest worker I ever had, and his girl, Eleanor, sweet as they come, always bringing us cookies on payday. I gently prodded, asking about those early years. It's for a family history project, I lied. Dad didn't talk much about before he started his own company. Tough times for them back then, George said. I remember when Eleanor was pregnant. They were just kids. So worried. They lived in that little apartment over the old bakery on Elm Street. Then, one day, she wasn't pregnant anymore. They were heartbroken. Bobby told me they'd done what they had to do to give the boy a good life. Never saw a man so torn up. He didn't know where the baby went, but he gave me something crucial, an address, the apartment over the bakery. I went there the next day. The bakery was now a yoga studio, but the apartment building was still there. I spoke to the landlord, another old-timer who had inherited the building from his father. He remembered the young couple. And he remembered the name of the family who lived next door to them, a quiet couple named Miller. The Millers had moved away a year later, but he remembered Mr. Miller worked for the county clerk's office. It was a tenuous thread, but I pulled on it. I searched for Millers who had worked at the county clerk's office in the late 70s. I found one, Thomas Miller, and then I hit the jackpot. Thomas Miller was listed as a witness on the court petition to unseal the adoption records that Mr. Albright and I had filed. He was a court-appointed intermediary for the adoption agency. At the same time, the court finally approved our petition. The sealed file was opened. The adoption papers were there, clear as day. A baby boy, born to Robert Vance and Eleanor Gable, was adopted by a couple named Stephen and Mary Jacobson. The boy's name was changed from Daniel Vance to David Jacobson. My hands were shaking as I ran a search for David Jacobson, born on the specified date. I found him. He was 48 years old. He lived in a town 50 miles away. He owned a local auto repair shop called Jacobson's Garage. The ghost in the records now had a name, a face from a grainy business profile picture, and a life. I had found him. I had found my brother. Finding David Jacobson on paper was one thing. Making contact was another beast entirely. For 2 days, I stared at the phone number for his garage, my thumb hovering over the call button. What do you say to a stranger who is also your brother? Hello, our parents gave you up for adoption 48 years ago, and by the way, you're entitled to a quarter of their estate, which my other siblings are currently trying to steal from me. It sounded insane. I decided a direct, in-person approach was better. It was harder to dismiss a person standing in front of you than a voice on the phone. Taking a deep breath, I drove the 50 miles to his town, a blue-collar community with a charming, old-fashioned main street. Jacobson's garage was easy to find, a clean, well-organized shop buzzing with activity. I saw him through the open bay door. He was leaning over the engine of a pickup truck, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was tall, with the same broad shoulders as my father, and his hair, though flecked with gray, was the same dark brown. When he turned to wipe his hands on a rag, I saw his eyes. They were my mother's eyes. A calm, kind hazel. My breath hitched. I walked into the small office, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. A young woman at the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak to David Jacobson, please," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's a personal matter." She gave me a curious look but called him over. He walked in, wiping grease from his hands. "I'm Dave," he said, his voice friendly and unassuming. "What can I do for you?" I held out my hand. "My name is Clara Vance." He shook my hand, his grip firm. The name Vance didn't seem to register. Of course, why would it? "This is going to sound very strange," I began, my carefully rehearsed speech deserting me. "I believe my father, Robert Vance, was also your biological father." His friendly expression vanished, replaced by a guarded, shuttered look. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive posture. "I think you have the wrong person." "Please," I said, my voice pleading. "Just give me 5 minutes. I have proof." I opened my tote bag and pulled out the copies of the adoption record and my father's letter. I laid them on the counter between us. He stared at the documents, his face pale. He read the names Robert Vance and Eleanor Gable. He picked up the letter, his calloused mechanic's hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile paper. He read it slowly, his eyes scanning the page. Then he read it again. The silence in the small office was deafening, broken only by the clang of a wrench from the garage. When he finally looked up, the defensiveness was gone, replaced by a profound, raw confusion. "My whole life, my parents, the Jacobsons, they were wonderful. They told me I was adopted. They said my birth parents were young and couldn't keep me. They never knew their names." He sank onto a stool, looking at me as if seeing a ghost. "Vance," he said, testing the name. "So that's who I was." We talked for over an hour. I told him everything. About our parents, their success, their love for their children, and their secret, lifelong regret. I told him about Grant and Serafina, their greed, and their plan to cut me out of the will. And I told him about the codicil and his rightful inheritance. He was quiet for a long time, processing a lifetime of new information. "So they thought about me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They didn't just forget." "Never," I said firmly. "They set money aside for you every year. They tried to find you. My father wrote that letter to make sure you got what was yours and to protect me." "And these other two," he said, a hard edge to his voice now. "The banker and the influencer, they want to cut you out." "They think I'm weak," I said. "They're in for a surprise." A slow smile spread across David's face. It was my father's smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "I just found out I have a family, and 2 of them are snakes and 1 of them is a fighter. I think I can live with those odds." In that moment, a bond formed. A shared sense of justice, a common enemy. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was my brother. We spent the rest of the afternoon making a plan. David agreed to come to the will reading. We met with Mr. Albright together the next day. Mr. Albright, ever the professional, calmly walked David through the legalities, showing him the official will, the codicil, and the statements for the hidden bank account. The amount in the account my parents had built for him was staggering, far more than David could have ever imagined. He just shook his head in disbelief, murmuring, "They really did this for me." The stage was set. Mr. Albright scheduled the reading for Friday morning. He sent a standard notice to Grant and Serafina. He sent a separate one to David Jacobson, without any explanation. My siblings, of course, would not recognize the name. They would assume he was a creditor or a minor beneficiary of some sort. The day before the reading, Serafina called me. "Clara, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Grant and I have been talking. We're worried about you handling all this financial stress. We've come up with a wonderful plan to manage your inheritance for you, to make sure you're taken care of for life. We can discuss it after the reading." "That's very thoughtful of you, Serafina," I replied, my voice a mask of calm. "Let's just see what Dad and Mom wanted first, shall we?" Her condescending tone, the transparent manipulation, it no longer angered me. It was pathetic. They were walking into a trap of their own making, blinded by arrogance. They thought they were the directors of this little drama, but the final act had already been written by my father years ago, and I was simply the one chosen to pull back the curtain. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. The conference room at Albright & Sons was exactly as I'd pictured it: mahogany table, leather chairs, and an air of solemn importance. Grant and Serafina were already there when I arrived. Grant was tapping impatiently on his phone, dressed in a suit so sharp it could cut glass. Serafina was artfully dabbing a dry eye with a silk handkerchief, her expression a perfect mask of bereaved sorrow for the benefit of Mr. Albright. They both gave me a nod of condescending pity, the kind one gives to a simple-minded relative. "Clara, so glad you could make it," Grant said, as if my attendance was in question. "Don't you worry about a thing, we'll walk you through it." "We're here for you," Serafina added, patting my hand with her cold fingers. I simply smiled. "I'm fine, thank you." The door opened, and Mr. Albright walked in, followed by a man they didn't recognize. David. He was dressed not in his mechanic's overalls, but in a simple, clean button-down shirt and dark trousers. He looked solid, unassuming, and completely out of key. Lace in my sibling's world. Grant shot him a dismissive, irritated look. "Who is this? Albright, our agreement was for family only." "Mr. Jacobson is here at my and your late father's request," Mr. Albright said calmly, gesturing for David to take a seat next to me. David met my eyes and gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. Serafina sniffed. "Is this about a bill? Can it be handled later? This is a private, emotional time for us." "All in due course," Mr. Albright said, taking his seat at the head of the table. He opened a large, leather-bound folder. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Robert and Alina Vance." My siblings leaned forward, their masks of grief slipping to reveal naked anticipation. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The jackpot. Mr. Albright began to read in his dry, formal tone. He went through the standard legal language. He detailed a few small bequests to charities and old friends. Then he got to the main body of the estate: the house, the investment portfolio, the savings. "All the remainder of my property, both real and personal," he read, "shall be divided equally in 3 shares among my beloved children: my son, Grant Robert Vance, my daughter, Serafina Rose Vance, and my daughter, Clara Ann Vance." Grant let out a small, triumphant sigh. Serafina's smile was smug. This was exactly what they expected: the perfect foundation for their plan to manage my share into their own pockets. They thought they had won. "However," Mr. Albright said, his voice firm, pausing to look at each of us over his glasses, "there is a codicil, a legally binding addendum to the will, signed and notarized by your father 10 years ago." Grant's smile faltered. "A codicil? What are you talking about? Dad never mentioned any codicil." "He was not legally required to," Mr. Albright stated flatly. He picked up a second document. "This codicil pertains to the existence of another heir." The air in the room went still. Grant and Serafina exchanged a confused, panicked look. "Another heir?" Serafina whispered, her voice cracking. "That's impossible." "I assure you, it is very possible," Mr. Albright continued. He looked directly at David. "The codicil acknowledges the existence of your parents' firstborn son, given up for adoption in 1977. His birth name was Daniel Vance." He then gestured to David. "Allow me to introduce you to David Jacobson, born Daniel Vance. Through a court-approved process, we have confirmed his identity beyond any legal doubt." The blood drained from Grant's face. Serafina let out a small, horrified gasp, her perfectly made-up face crumbling into a mask of disbelief. They stared at David as if he were an apparition. "This is insane," Grant exploded, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a scam. You can't just bring some mechanic in here and claim he's our brother." "The DNA test, which Mr. Jacobson graciously agreed to, says otherwise," Mr. Albright said, sliding a lab report across the table. "It's a 99.99% match to Robert Vance, based on samples we had on file. He is your brother. Per the Codicil, the estate is now to be divided into 4 equal shares." Serafina looked like she was going to faint. "A fourth we have to share with him," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at David. But Mr. Albright wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence. "The Codicil has a second clause." He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Grant and Serafina. "This clause is most pertinent. It reads, 'Should any of my children be found to have acted in bad faith, with malicious or predatory intent toward any of their siblings in matters concerning this will and my estate, their portion of the inheritance shall be reduced to the token sum of $1,000. Grant froze, his mouth half open. Serafina's eyes were wide with terror. Mr. Albright continued, his voice resonating with the full weight of my father's foresight. "Clara has provided me with a sworn, detailed affidavit concerning conversations she overheard, in which you, Grant, and you, Serafina, conspired to manipulate her into surrendering her inheritance. A plan to manage her share and place it under your control." He let the words hang in the air. The silence was absolute. "That's a lie," Grant sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a venomous fury. "She's making it up." The quiet little mouse finally grew a spine and decided to lie. "Is it a lie, Serafina?" I asked softly, turning to my sister. "Is it a lie that you were going to use my fragility as a narrative for your followers, that you thought my life was small and I didn't need the money?" Serafina paled, speechless. She knew I had them. Mr. Albright cleared his throat. "Given the evidence and the clear intent described, I have no choice but to enact this clause. Grant Vance and Serafina Vance, your shares of the Vance estate are hereby read. Used to $1,000 each." The sound Grant made was a strangled mix of a gasp and a roar. Serafina finally broke, letting out a wail of pure, unfiltered anguish, her carefully constructed persona shattering into a million pieces. "The remainder of their shares," Mr. Albright concluded, looking at me and then at David, "will be divided equally between the remaining, non-malicious heirs. The estate will be split 50-50 between Clara Vance and David Jacobson." It was done. The entire toxic plan, their years of condescension and greed, all of it destroyed in an instant. The look on their faces was everything I had imagined and more. It wasn't a look of triumph for me, but of utter, ruinous shock for them. They hadn't just lost the money. They had been exposed. Their true, ugly natures had been laid bare in the sterile, quiet room. My father's final plan, his ultimate act of protection, had been executed perfectly. Justice had been served. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Grant erupted into a furious, incoherent tirade, accusing Mr. Albright of incompetence, me of treachery, and David of being a gold-digging fraud. He threatened lawsuits, investigations, and every form of retribution his rage-addled mind could conjure. Serafina was a different kind of spectacle. Her weeping devolved into hysterical sobbing, her words a jumbled mess of "it's not fair," and "my brand is ruined," and "how could you do this to me, Clara?" It was a masterclass in victimhood, but the audience was no longer buying it. Mr. Albright remained impassive, waiting for the storm to pass. David, my newfound brother, simply sat there, his expression unreadable but his presence a solid, calming anchor in the tempest. He didn't gloat or sneer. He just watched them, a silent observer to the meltdown of 2 people he barely knew but who had inadvertently changed his life forever. I said nothing. I just watched them. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a play I had read many times before. The anger I had held onto for weeks had vanished, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. These were my siblings, the people I had shared a childhood with, and this is what they had become. Their greed had consumed them so completely that they couldn't see the moral abyss they had fallen into. Eventually, their fury sputtered out, leaving behind only the acrid smoke of defeat. Grant, his face pale and slick with sweat, pointed a trembling finger at me. "You will regret this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He then turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard that a framed print on the wall skewed sideways. Serafina, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks, gave me a look of pure, childish betrayal. "I hate you," she sobbed, before gathering her designer handbag and scurrying out after him. And then there was silence. The dust, both literal and metaphorical, began to settle. Mr. Albright let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said, with magnificent understatement, "I dare say that went as expected." He looked at me, a glimmer of pride in his old eyes. "Your father would have been very proud of you, Clara. You did the right thing." David finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you," he said, looking at me. "Not just for this," he gestured around the room, "at the will, the inheritance, but for finding me, for giving me a piece of my past I never knew I was missing." "They were good people, our parents," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And you're my brother, you deserve to know." In the weeks that followed, Grant and Serafina became ghosts. Grant, true to his word, tried to file a lawsuit, but Mr. Albright informed him that challenging a will with such a clear and legally sound, bad faith clause was virtually impossible and would only cost him money he apparently no longer had in abundance. His bluster faded into a bitter, resentful silence. We heard through the grapevine that his high-stakes career had been built on a mountain of debt, and he had been counting on the inheritance to keep his lavish lifestyle afloat. Without it, his financial house of cards began to crumble. Serafina's downfall was more public. She tried to spin the story on her social media, painting herself as the victim of a cruel, manipulative sister and a long-lost grifter. But she made a mistake. In her tearful, rambling video, she let slip details about trying to protect my share of the money. Her followers, usually so adoring, were not stupid. The comments section turned on her, accusing her of being a greedy, entitled hypocrite. Her brand of authenticity was shattered. She lost thousands of followers overnight, and her sponsors began to pull their contracts. Her curated world collapsed. I didn't rejoice in their misery. There was no pleasure in it. It was just the logical conclusion of the path they had chosen. They had built their lives on foundations of greed and arrogance. And now they were living in the rubble. My life, on the other hand, began to rebuild on a new, stronger foundation. The house, now half owned by me, was no longer a place of sorrow but a place of connection. David and I decided not to sell it. Instead, we began the slow process of truly cleaning it out, not as a liquidation of assets, but as an act of remembrance. We spent weekends together, sifting through the attic, and this time it was a joyful discovery. He would find an old report card of Grant's, and I would find a box of Serafina's childhood drawings. We learned about the siblings they were before the world had twisted them. And we learned about our parents. He would tell me stories about his adoptive parents, the Jacobsons, who were loving and kind and had given him a wonderful life. I would tell him stories about Robert and Alina, showing him photos, letting him get to know the young, scared couple who had made an impossible choice. We found we had a shared, dry sense of humor and a similar, no-nonsense approach to life. He was a mechanic, I was an archivist. We were both fixers of a sort, people who found satisfaction in putting things in order. The inheritance was a life-changing sum of money for both of us, but it felt secondary to what we had truly gained. I paid off my small mortgage and set up a comfortable retirement fund. David expanded his garage, hired more staff, and finally took his wife on the honeymoon to Italy they had been dreaming of for 20 years. The money was a gift, a final act of love from our parents, but the true inheritance was each other. In their desperate attempt to write me out of our family's future, my siblings had inadvertently led me to its forgotten past. They had tried to leave me with nothing, and in doing so, had given me a brother. The house was no longer hollow. It was filled with a new kind of laughter, a new kind of family. And I was no longer the quiet, overlooked anchor. I was the keeper of our true story, a story of justice, of connection, and of a bond that not even greed could break.